The Backyard Stranger. It started the night we moved into the new house. My parents were still unpacking boxes in the kitchen, and I was in the living room, trying to set up my game console. I kept glancing out the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard because I thought I saw something move. At first, I chalked it up to being tired. It had been a long day of driving and hauling furniture, but then I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the tree line at the back of the yard, barely visible in the dim light from our patio. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. I froze, unsure of what to do. When I finally called for my dad and pointed him out, the man was gone. My dad brushed it off, said it was probably just a neighbor or someone passing through, but something about it didn't feel right. The next few days were uneventful. I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. It wasn't until the following Friday night that I saw him again. This time, I was in my room, which faced the backyard, when I noticed movement outside. The security light we had installed flicked on, and there he was, closer this time. He was standing by the shed near the back fence, staring directly at the house. I could see him more clearly now. Tall, scruffy, and wearing a jacket that looked way too heavy for the weather. My stomach dropped. I didn't tell anyone right away. I mean, what was I supposed to say? There's a creepy guy standing in our backyard. It sounded ridiculous. Instead, I just locked my window and closed the blinds, praying he'd go away. The next morning, I checked the backyard from the kitchen window before heading out for school. There was no sign of him, but something felt off. The shed door was slightly open. I asked my dad about it, and he said he hadn't been in there yet since we moved in. He figured it might have been the wind and said he'd lock it later. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that someone had touched our stuff. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I even asked my dad to double check, which earned me an eye roll, but he did it anyway. Around midnight, I woke up to a tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch hitting my window. It had happened before during a storm, but when I sat up, I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights through the blinds. Then, I heard it again. My heart raced as I turned toward the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move. Gathering every ounce of courage, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. My stomach turned to ice. He was there. Not in the yard this time, but right outside my window, staring up at me with this blank, almost detached expression. I didn't know what to do. My parents were asleep down the hall, and I was too scared to make a sound. I just stood there, frozen, watching him. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring up at me like he was waiting for something. His face was pale, and his eyes looked almost sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I finally managed to back away from the window, my legs shaking so bad I thought I might collapse. I grabbed my phone, but my hands were trembling so much that I almost dropped it. I texted my dad instead of calling. I was too scared of the noise alerting the man outside. "There's someone in the backyard, by my window." Dad burst into my room less than a minute later. His footsteps loud enough to break the silence that had wrapped around the house like a suffocating blanket. He had a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other, his face set in a mix of anger and worry. I pointed to the window, but when he yanked the blinds open, the man was gone. The yard was empty, the grass swaying gently in the wind under the pale glow of the motion light. My dad didn't say anything at first, just scanned the yard with a flashlight, then went out to check the locks again. When he came back, he tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some guy passing through, but I could tell he didn't believe it either. That night, I barely slept, every little sound making me jump. The next day, Dad installed more locks and even got a camera for the backyard. I thought that might give me some peace of mind, but it didn't. Every time I walked past a window, I felt like he was out there, watching, waiting. The camera didn't pick up anything unusual that first night, and for a moment, I started to think maybe it was over. But then, on the third night, I woke up to the sound of the alarm. The camera had detected movement. My parents and I rushed to the living room where the monitor was set up, and there he was, clear as day on the screen. The man was back, standing just outside the shed again, his face barely visible under the shadow of his hood. This time, Dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bat and stormed outside, yelling for the guy to get off our property. Mom called the police while I stayed frozen, staring at the screen. I watched as Dad's flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on the shed. By the time he got there, the man was gone, just like before. Dad came back in, frustrated and shaken. The police showed up about 20 minutes later, but there wasn't much they could do. They took a report and promised to keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Probably a drifter, one of them said. I wanted to scream. How could they not see how wrong this was? The tension in the house was unbearable after that. Every night, I'd hear the faint creaks of my parents pacing the hallways or checking the locks again. Even though I was terrified, I started sleeping with my curtains open, thinking that if I kept watch, I'd see him coming before he got too close. It didn't help. A few nights later, the motion light came on again, flooding the backyard in a cold, bright glow. This time, though, he wasn't near the shed. He was at the patio door. I'll never forget the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He pressed his face to the glass, his breath fogging it up slightly, and I swear he smiled when he saw me staring back. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I screamed, and within seconds, my dad was there, bat in hand. The man didn't even flinch. He just turned and walked calmly back toward the trees as if nothing had happened. Dad threw the door open and yelled after him, but he was already gone. The police came again, this time doing a sweep of the yard, but they didn't find anything. They suggested it might be a prank, maybe some local teenager messing around. But it didn't feel like a prank to me. After that night, we stopped feeling safe in the house. My parents started making serious plans to move, but it would take time. Meanwhile, the cameras finally caught something strange. A few days later, we reviewed the footage from the night he had been at the patio door. Right before he appeared, the camera picked up movement near the shed. The door opened slightly, and a shadow emerged. It hit me all at once. He wasn't just lurking in our backyard. He'd been living in the shed the entire time. My dad and I went out to check the shed that afternoon, and what we found made my stomach churn. There was an old, stained sleeping bag stuffed in the corner, along with food wrappers and water bottles. Worse, there were small items that had gone missing from our yard, a pair of garden gloves, a broken flashlight we thought we'd lost. The police came back when we called, and this time, they seemed to take it more seriously. They told us they'd increased patrols in the area and warned our neighbors to be on the lookout. That night, I couldn't sleep again, terrified he might come back. The next morning, we heard the news. A man had been caught trying to break into another house a few streets over. He matched the description of the guy we'd been seeing. When the police searched the property, they found more evidence linking him to our shed, including tools he'd used to try and force open windows in the neighborhood. It was a small relief to know he'd been caught, but even now, I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll glance out the window and expect to see him standing there, just beyond the trees. The strange neighbor. I moved into my new house 3 years ago, around late October. I had just finalized my divorce, and the idea of a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood sounded perfect. The house wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom with a backyard big enough for my dog, Cooper. Life had been chaotic, so I was looking forward to settling in, working remotely, and spending weekends fixing up the place. The neighborhood seemed friendly enough. I'd wave at the occasional jogger or dog walker, but I wasn't in a rush to meet anyone. My plan was to keep to myself for a while, get my bearings and enjoy the peace. About a week after I moved in, I got my first visitor. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I was in the garage sorting through some old boxes when I heard a knock at the side door. Standing there was a woman, mid-30s maybe, with short blonde hair tucked under a bright yellow headband. She was holding a plate of cookies and introduced herself as Linda, saying she lived just down the street. She had this overly warm smile, the kind that felt slightly forced but not enough to raise red flags. We exchanged small talk, and I thanked her for the cookies. She asked if I had a hammer she could borrow, and since I just unpacked my tools, I handed it over without thinking much about it. Linda promised to return it the next day, and that was that, or so I thought. The next day came and went, but Linda didn't show up to return the hammer. I wasn't particularly worried. It's easy to forget these things, and I figured I'd see her again eventually. A few days later, though, there was another knock on my door. It was Linda again, this time holding a small potted plant. A housewarming gift, she said with that same bright smile. I thanked her, and before I could ask about the hammer, she casually brought up needing a screwdriver for some project she was working on. I didn't think twice and lent her one. Something about her felt off, though. Maybe it was the way she lingered just a little too long in the doorway, glancing past me into the house. But I brushed it off, reminding myself it was nice of her to stop by at all. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda became a regular presence. She'd show up every few days, sometimes asking for tools, other times just to chat. I noticed she never talked about specifics, like where exactly on the street she lived or what she did for work. Whenever I asked about her house, she'd deflect with a vague comment, like how things always need fixing, or how the street gets so quiet at night. The visit started to feel less neighborly and more intrusive, but I didn't know how to confront her without seeming rude. Besides, there was always an excuse to justify her behavior, until one night, when I spotted her standing at the end of my driveway. She wasn't knocking or calling out. She was just watching. That moment at the end of the driveway was when things started to get genuinely unsettling. It was around 11 p.m., and I had just turned off the TV and was heading to bed. Through the window, I saw Linda standing there, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. She wasn't moving, just staring at my house, hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should do something. Eventually, I decided to step out onto the porch and call out to her. "Linda, everything okay?" She didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, she waved awkwardly and said, "Oh, I was just out for a walk. Sorry if I startled you." Then, without another word, she turned and walked down the street. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I decided to take a walk myself and see if I could figure out where she lived. As I wandered up and down the block, I didn't see anything that seemed like her place. No sign of her car in any driveway, no tools I might have lent her scattered about. Feeling silly, I decided to let it go. Maybe she lived farther down the street than I thought. But that evening, as I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, I caught movement outside the window. Linda was there again, standing in nearly the same spot as the night before. This time, she wasn't alone. A dark sedan idled a few feet behind her, its engine quietly humming. I watched from behind the curtain, heart pounding as the scene unfolded. Linda stood motionless, staring directly at my house. The car's headlights were off, and though I couldn't see through the tinted windows, I had the unnerving sense that someone was inside, watching too. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? That my neighbor was acting strange? Before I could decide, Linda turned abruptly, got into the passenger seat of the car, and it sped off down the street. I stayed frozen by the window for several minutes after they were gone, trying to convince myself it wasn't as creepy as it seemed. Maybe she was just getting a ride home, though I couldn't figure out why she'd need one if she lived nearby. The next day, I decided to casually ask some of the neighbors about Linda. I approached an older woman who lived across the street while she was out gardening. I described Linda and asked which house she lived in. The woman gave me a confused look and said she didn't know anyone by that name. I tried the couple 2 doors down. Same response. No one seemed to know her, and a pit began forming in my stomach. That evening, I was determined to confront her if she showed up again. Around 9 p.m., as I was locking up for the night, I heard a faint knock at the back door. The knock at the back door sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap, like someone didn't want to wake the whole house. I hesitated, staring at the door. No one should have been back there. The yard was fenced, and the gate was locked. Grabbing a flashlight from the counter, I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. The knock came again, this time a little louder. Heart racing, I swung open the door and shone the flashlight into the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure dart around the corner of the house, but when I stepped out, the yard was empty. The gate was still latched. It didn't make sense. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house making me jump. The next morning, I checked the backyard and found something that made my stomach drop. Sitting on the ground near the back door was the hammer I'd lent Linda weeks ago. It looked freshly wiped down, like someone had cleaned it before leaving it there. I was officially freaked out. I decided to install some security cameras, even if just for my peace of mind. That evening, after setting up the system, I sat down to review the feed. At around 3 a.m. the previous night, the camera near the back door caught a figure crouching in the yard. It was Linda. She was holding the hammer and staring at the door, completely still, for what must have been several minutes before she gently placed it down and walked away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I rewound the footage, hoping I'd misinterpreted it somehow, but there she was, Linda, in the middle of the night, lurking in my backyard like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her movements were so deliberate, almost mechanical, as if she'd done this before. My stomach churned as I thought about how close she'd been while I was inside, completely unaware. I saved the footage to my phone and decided I needed to get the police involved. But as I reached for my phone to call, another thought struck me. I still didn't know who she was or where she came from. What if calling the cops only escalated things? The next day, I was on edge the entire time. Every little noise made me jump, and Cooper, usually calm, seemed restless too, pacing near the windows and growling at nothing. Around sunset, I noticed a car slowing as it passed my house. It was the same dark sedan from before. It crept by, almost idling, and then sped up as soon as I stepped outside. I snapped a photo of the license plate just in case. That night, as I reviewed the footage from the cameras, my heart sank. At around 2 a.m., the sedan had parked down the street, and Linda got out. For the next hour, the cameras caught glimpses of her circling my house, disappearing and reappearing like she was testing my boundaries. She never approached the doors this time, but the way she moved, slow and deliberate, was somehow worse than the knocking. By the next morning, I was done trying to handle this on my own. I called the police and showed them the footage. The officer who came over was polite but non-committal. He said they'd look into it and suggested I keep my doors locked and lights on at night. That wasn't exactly reassuring, but at least there was now a record of what was happening. I also handed over the photo of the license plate, which he promised to run. Still, as the sun went down that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I double-checked the locks, turned on every light in the house, and even slept with Cooper on the bed for the first time ever. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I woke up to Cooper barking furiously. The sound jolted me upright, and I immediately reached for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand. I crept to the window, trying to see what had set him off, and that's when I saw her again. Linda, standing on the front porch this time, staring directly at the camera mounted above the door. But she wasn't alone. The dark sedan was parked in the driveway, its headlights on, casting an eerie glow across the yard. I couldn't see who was in the driver's seat, but Linda wasn't trying to get in. She was just standing there, completely still, holding something in her hand. It looked like a piece of paper, folded neatly. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched Linda on the porch. Cooper's barking grew louder, but she didn't flinch. Slowly, she reached up and slid the folded paper into the gap between the door frame and the camera mount. Then, without looking back, she walked down the steps and got into the passenger seat of the sedan. The car reversed out of my driveway and disappeared into the night. I stayed frozen by the window, trying to process what I'd just seen. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to go downstairs and check the note. My hand shook as I unfolded it, revealing just 5 words written in neat, blocky handwriting. "You shouldn't have called them." Panic set in immediately. How could she have known I called the police? Had they already contacted her? Or was she somehow watching me? Every explanation I came up with made me feel worse. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I called the police again, but the officer I spoke with sounded indifferent, even annoyed. He told me they hadn't made contact with anyone yet and suggested the note might just be a coincidence. A coincidence? It was clear I was on my own. I decided to spend the day out of the house, giving myself some distance to think. But when I got back that evening, I found something waiting for me in the backyard. My screwdriver, stabbed into the ground like a marker, with a fresh, wet stain smeared across its handle. Seeing the screwdriver made my stomach drop. I didn't want to get close to it, but the dark stain on the handle was unmistakable blood, fresh enough to glisten in the fading light. My first instinct was to call the police again, but after their lukewarm response earlier, I knew they'd probably just brush me off. Instead, I grabbed an old pair of gloves from the garage, carefully removed the screwdriver, and placed it in a sealed plastic bag. My thoughts raced. Was this a threat? A warning? And where had the blood come from? My mind went to Cooper, but a quick check showed he was fine, wagging his tail nervously by the back door. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened nearby. I decided to spend that night at a friend's house. It felt safer to be anywhere but there. I told my friend Mike the basics of what had been happening, leaving out the blood-stained screwdriver because I wasn't ready to explain that part yet. Mike insisted I stay as long as I needed, and for the first time in days, I felt a little more at ease. But around 1 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security camera app. Someone was at my house. I hesitated, but eventually, I opened the live feed. The front porch camera showed Linda again, standing in the same spot as before. This time, she wasn't holding a note or a tool. Instead, she was holding a leash. At the end of it was a dog that looked just like Cooper. My blood turned to ice. I bolted upright, muttering something incoherent to Mike as I fumbled for my shoes. "She has my dog." I finally managed to yell, grabbing my keys and rushing to the door. Mike tried to stop me, insisting we call the police instead, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I was running on pure adrenaline. The drive back to my house was a blur. When I pulled into the driveway, Linda was gone, and so was the dog. Cooper's leash was lying abandoned on the porch, coiled neatly like it had been placed there intentionally. I called out his name, my voice cracking with desperation, and ran into the house, searching every room. But he wasn't there. As I stood in the empty living room, trying to make sense of everything, my phone buzzed again, a new notification from the cameras. I opened the app with shaking hands, half afraid of what I might see. The backyard feed showed Linda, crouching just outside the camera's range. She was holding something small and furry. Cooper. He looked limp in her arms. I could barely breathe as I watched her whisper something into his ear, then lay him gently on the ground. She stood up, stared directly at the camera, and gave the smallest, most unsettling smile before walking away. By the time I got to the yard, she was gone. But Cooper was there, alive but trembling, with a strange red ribbon tied around his collar. I dropped to my knees and scooped Cooper into my arms, checking him over for injuries. He was shaking like a leaf, his fur damp and cold to the touch, but he didn't seem hurt. The red ribbon tied around his collar was the only new thing, a silky, pristine bow that looked freshly tied. I untied it carefully, half expecting something to fall out of it, but it was just a plain ribbon. Still, it felt like a message, though I had no idea what it meant. As I carried Cooper back inside, I realized my hands were trembling as much as he was. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some bizarre neighborly behavior. It was calculated, and it was escalating. The next morning, I finally got a call back from the police. They'd run the license plate I'd provided and told me it belonged to a rental car registered under a fake name. No leads. I asked about Linda, whether they'd done any follow-up on her, but they said they couldn't pursue it unless I had a full name or an address. Frustrated and terrified, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spent the day driving up and down the surrounding streets, hoping I'd spot the sedan or something that would give me a clue. By late afternoon, I was ready to give up when I saw it. The dark sedan parked outside a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. My heart raced as I pulled into the lot and parked a few spaces down. I sat in the car for what felt like forever, watching the sedan. The motel looked like something out of a bad movie. Faded neon sign, peeling paint, and a parking lot littered with cigarette butts. I couldn't see much movement, but the curtains in one of the upstairs windows twitched every so often, like someone was watching. My palms were slick with sweat, and I debated whether I should go inside or just wait. Finally, the door to the room opened, and Linda stepped out, carrying a small black duffel bag. She wasn't smiling this time. Her expression was sharp, purposeful. She got into the sedan and drove off, leaving me parked there, unsure of what to do next. I decided to check out the room she'd just left. My hands shook as I approached the door, half expecting her to pop out of nowhere. To my surprise, it was unlocked. Inside, the room was dim and smelled faintly of mildew. It was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a table, and a chair, but it was the walls that made my stomach churn. They were covered with photos, dozens of them, taped up haphazardly. Pictures of me, my house, my dog. There were even shots taken through my windows, showing me sitting at the kitchen table or watching TV. I felt nauseous, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. But the thing that scared me most was the note taped to the mirror, written in the same blocky handwriting as before. This isn't over. I staggered back, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to rip the photos down, destroy every trace of what I was seeing, but something stopped me. Maybe fear, maybe instinct. Instead, I snapped pictures of everything with my phone, making sure to capture the note on the mirror. My mind raced as I considered my next move. Should I call the police again, or would they just dismiss this too? I decided to leave everything untouched, hoping it would give them enough to take me seriously this time. I practically sprinted back to my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. My hands shook as I dialed the non-emergency line and explained what I'd found. To my relief, they said they'd send someone immediately. The officers who arrived were far more engaged than the last time. They combed through the motel room, taking photos and bagging evidence. One of them pulled me aside to ask questions while the other inspected the photos on the walls. "You're lucky you found this," the officer said, his tone grim. "This kind of thing, it rarely ends well." I asked what they meant, but they wouldn't elaborate, only promising to file a full report. They advised me to stay somewhere else for a while, just to be safe. I didn't need convincing. That night, I packed a bag for Cooper and me and went straight to Mike's house. refusing to go back alone. The next few days at Mike's were tense but uneventful. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. Cooper stuck close to me, his usual playful energy replaced by nervous pacing and frequent whining. The police called once to update me, saying they were still looking for Linda and the sedan but hadn't turned up much. It felt like my life was stuck in limbo, the threat of her return looming like a dark cloud. I thought about leaving town altogether, but I didn't want to abandon my home, not without some closure. On the fourth night, as Mike and I were watching TV, my phone buzzed again with a notification from the cameras. I hesitated before opening the app, terrified of what I might see. The feed showed my front yard, but it wasn't Linda this time. It was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap that cast his face in shadow. He was pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to peer into the windows. My stomach churned as I recognized the duffel bag he was carrying, the same one Linda had at the motel. I immediately called the police, giving them my address and explaining the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but as I kept watching the feed, the man suddenly stopped pacing. He turned toward the camera, staring directly into it. Then, in a deliberate motion, he reached up and smashed it with what looked like a tire iron. The feed went black. The moment the feed went black, my chest tightened like a vice. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed my car keys and told Mike we had to go back. He protested, but I wasn't hearing it. Everything in me screamed that this was the end game, and I needed to face it head on. I loaded Cooper into the car and drove faster than I probably should have, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. When I pulled onto my street, I saw flashing lights. 2 police cruisers were parked outside my house, their red and blue beams slicing through the darkness. An officer waved me down as I got out of the car. "We got him," he said, his expression grim but resolute. My heart was racing as he explained that they'd found the man hiding in the bushes by the side of the house, armed with a tire iron and a large hunting knife. The duffel bag was stuffed with duct tape, zip ties, and what looked like syringes. I felt a wave of nausea as it dawned on me just how close I'd come to something truly horrifying. They took my statement again, piecing together everything that had happened since Linda's first visit. The police later informed me that Linda's real name wasn't Linda at all. She was connected to the man, a partner, an accomplice, or something even darker. They'd both been wanted in another state for stalking and suspected kidnapping. The motel room was a staging ground, and I had been their target. To this day, I don't know why they chose me, and maybe I never will. I sold the house a month later and moved across the country. I'm safer now, but I still double-check my locks every night, and sometimes, when Cooper barks at nothing, I wonder if she's still out there, watching. The apartment knocker. When I moved into this apartment, I was just relieved to finally have a place of my own. I'd spent months crashing with friends, dealing with flaky landlords, and navigating the chaos of the housing market. So, when I finally got the keys to this place, I felt like I could breathe again. It was a small unit, just a one-bedroom in an older building, but it had character. High ceilings, big windows, and even a little balcony. The first few weeks were uneventful, almost peaceful. My neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves, and the building was quiet at night, which was perfect for me since I work late and need my rest. Then, out of nowhere, it started. It was just past 2 a.m. the first time I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door, loud enough to jolt me out of the half-asleep state I'd been in. I froze for a second, trying to shake off the haze, and then got up to check. By the time I made it to the peephole, the hallway was empty. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out, and saw nothing but dim lighting and the faded carpet stretching to the end of the corridor. I convinced myself it was probably someone drunk, knocking on the wrong door, and went back to bed. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same knocks. And again, when I checked, no one was there. By the third night, I was starting to get irritated. It wasn't just the knocks, it was the timing. Always just after 2 a.m., like clockwork. This time, I decided to wait by the door. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and kept the lights off, figuring whoever it was wouldn't expect me to be ready for them. Sure enough, right at 2:10 a.m., there it was, 3 hard knocks. My heart was pounding as I yanked the door open, expecting to catch someone red-handed, but there was nothing. Not a sound, not a shadow, just that same empty hallway. It didn't make sense. There's no way someone could have knocked and disappeared that fast, unless they were sprinting. After that, I started to feel paranoid. I kept my curtains closed, double-checked the locks, and even propped a chair against the door at night, like I'd seen in movies. I told myself it was ridiculous, but the knocks kept coming every night. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone knocked on my door a few times and disappeared? They'd laugh me off the phone. Still, the whole thing was getting to me. I barely slept, jumped at every little noise, and started second-guessing if I'd made a mistake moving here. I decided to bring it up with the building manager. She was an older woman named Carol, friendly but no nonsense, the kind who seemed like she'd seen everything. When I mentioned the knocks, she frowned and said, "That's odd. No one's reported anything like that before." She promised to check the security cameras in the hallway, which I didn't even realize existed until then. That gave me some hope. Finally, I might get proof of whatever was going on. But when I followed up with her a few days later, she just shook her head. "There's nothing on the footage," she said. "Your hallway's dead quiet all night." That answer chilled me more than I wanted to admit. If no one was there, who or what was knocking? By this point, I was starting to dread nighttime. I'd sit up in bed, staring at the clock, counting down until it was 2 a.m. And without fail, the knocks would come. 3 sharp bangs that echoed through the quiet. One night, I even recorded the sound on my phone, hoping to prove I wasn't losing my mind. When I played it back, though, the audio was weirdly muffled, like the knocks were coming from far away, even though they'd sounded loud and clear in the moment. After nearly 2 weeks of this, I was at my wit's end. My nerves were shot, and I was running on barely any sleep. That's when I decided to take things a step further. I set up my phone to record video, propped it on a stack of books near the door, and let it run all night. I figured if I couldn't catch the knocker in the act, maybe the camera could. But when I checked the footage the next morning, the recording showed something I couldn't explain. The knocks were there, clear as day, but the hallway outside the door was completely empty. No one approaching, no one leaving. Just the sound of knocking, coming from nowhere. That was the breaking point for me. I went back to Carol, this time practically begging her to do something. She listened patiently, then sighed like she was reluctant to tell me something. "You know," she said, "there was someone else interested in your unit before you moved in. A guy. His friend lived here and wanted him to take it, but the landlord chose you instead." She didn't say much more, just hinted that maybe someone was holding a grudge. It sounded far-fetched, but at least it was an explanation. I decided to file a formal complaint, just in case. I didn't expect much, but I was desperate. After filing the complaint, things finally came to a head. A few days later, Carol knocked on my door during the afternoon. She told me they'd spoken to one of my neighbors, a guy a few doors down. Apparently, he admitted to knocking on my door at night. He said he was just messing around because his friend hadn't gotten the apartment. Carol assured me he'd been warned, and if it happened again, there'd be consequences. I was furious, but mostly relieved to have an answer. I couldn't believe someone would go that far over something so petty. Strangely, after that conversation, the knocking stopped completely. I thought I'd finally be able to relax, but part of me still feels uneasy. I mean, I saw the security footage, There was no one in the hallway when those knocks happened. So, how do I explain that? Was it really just the neighbor the whole time? Or was there something else happening that night? Something he wouldn't or couldn't admit to? I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes, late at night, I still find myself listening, waiting for those knocks to come back.